those of you who know me, you've heard me talk about that I'm a master grief counselor, and there are a few things that pull out all the emotions related to grief more than risk management and design controls. So buckle up. And I didn't bring my puppies overseas, but we have animal therapy for you available as well. So today we're going to talk about the state of art and standard of care, and is this more than just semantics? And again, in those previous, every presentation I saw this morning is talking about, is it really semantics? Did they, like Steve said in the last session, do you even think they meant to write that like that? So we're going to see how that plays out now, specifically in state of the art, compared to some of the other discussions that we've had. So are these really interchangeable concepts? Well, we have to understand what the point of view of the stakeholders are. And that's really kind of looking like a crystal ball that says, well, the future's not clear. You have all of these different players that don't even include industry in organizations that have some sort of stakeholder rights or inputs into this process. And it can be tricky because they all seem to be aligned in the same mission, and that is for patient safety. But they're coming from different responsibilities in that. National competent authorities are like your in-country FDAs that are responsible for enforcing the regulations. You have your notified bodies that are responsible for assessing the conformity to the regulations. Then you've got the European Standardization Committee that's responsible for creating and drafting the standards that are going to demonstrate that you have safety and reliability. And then you've got the, last but not least, you've got the European Commission that is responsible for actually creating and enacting that legislation. So all of these stakeholders, we've ended up lost in space over their role in this process, but again, also in languages. So we're not only trying to translate between the different perspectives of the stakeholders, oftentimes you're even trying to actually translate languages back and forth. So there's a lot that can get lost in interpretation differences. Because now this isn't even legislation anymore, it's just interpretation. And so that's going to leave, so the legislation starts with the European Commission, and it rolls downhill, and we all know what happens when things roll downhill, to the national competent authorities and the notified bodies who are responsible for enacting that legislation. And now the poor notified body and the manufacturers, to a large extent, are just stuck with speculating what all that meant before it rolled down and pushed them off the hill in the first place. So to further complicate things, we have a lot of turnover within the notified bodies. Not only were so many decertified over the last several years, but now they're all competing with the same technical resources, and it's really hard to get a notified body and then get consistency with your auditor from start to finish. So what did all this mean or is it going to all mean for EU patients? Well, even the European Commission now is concerned about that growing access to care for innovative medical devices and for ongoing support, like are manufacturers going to submit or not for the MDR. We still don't have a good picture of how many CE mark certificates don't have quotes or contracts accepted yet. So now let's really dive into these concepts of standard of care and state of the art in context of the stakeholder perspective and all of the documentation that exists. So if we start with the life cycle of state of the art, and we start with existing state of the art, and I think most of us can kind of mentally align that, you look things up on Google and these are the commonly accepted definitions. So we've got the most sophisticated stage of technology, art, or science that is the result of modern medicines, and it's the most up-to-date features. But if we look at 14971, which for the first time in history defined state-of-the-art in 2019. They talk about state-of-the-art 15 times in the standard, but they defined it as it's generally accepted as good practice in both technology and medicine. But this is the fun part. It does not imply the actually technologically most advanced solution. So now you're going to be like, well, Michelle, why are we counting these terms? Well, because you have to understand where the term is used and the context around the term to extrapolate what is meant in the scope of that definition. So for the life cycle of the state of the art, now we're moving into existing standard of care. So what does standard of care mean? Well, it's the appropriate treatment based on scientific evidence and collaboration between professionals. It's the level at which the average prudent provider in a given community would practice. And my favorite, what a minimally competent physician in the same field would do in the same situation and the same resources. Here's the problem. Where is the standard of care? I own some land in very rural Mississippi where the population is 83. Ask me about that over a cocktail. Or are you getting treated at the Cleveland Clinic or even a suburb of the Cleveland Clinic where the general practitioners, as soon as they think something's bad wrong, they're going to just send you on to a specialist? Are you going to be in what I've been told is the Czech Republic on this map, or China? This all makes a huge difference in standard of care and what does it mean in context of your evaluation. So if we move on and we look at these definitions in the context of MDR. So in terms of stakeholders, this is coming upstream from the commission, and this is kind of the start of everything that's rolling down right now. It does have 70 new definitions, which seems like it would be helpful, but it does not define either the standard of art or standard of care. It does mention state of the art 11 times, though. So again, it's important to look at where they've used in the context around them. So state of art is, they talk about it specifically around the intended purpose in medicine, and it has to be supported by safety principles and risk controls. It goes on to talk about state of the art in clinical applications that include clinical care and clinical practice. So now we're moving towards something that sounds more like a standard of care as opposed to a technological state of the art. So as Pooja was talking about, now we have an evolution in our risk considerations for our medical devices. And we are all familiar with the adoption curve of new technology, where you've always got your innovators and your early adopters, and then you've got your laggards at the end that are just resistant to what that new technology is. So that means that we've got this diagram going on of the state of the art, kind of pushing the standard of care, and then there's a point at which they overlap. So, lucky for us, the commission has published all kinds of helpful documents to put more context around standard of care and state of the art. So this is an oldie but a goodie. MedDev 2.7.1 does not define state of the art or standard of care, but it mentions state of the art 39 times. And the guidance, I don't think, is quite that long, or not much longer than that. But amongst those 39 times, it talks about that you need to understand the state of the art in relation to alternative therapies, and not only other devices, but we're talking possibly a surgery, possibly a drug that came out. We have to look at clinical practice guidelines. In the US, we have something called the Joint Commission that kind of helps to oversee or push the practice of medicine. Then you've got your current interventions that are available for intended patient population. Is your patients, are they pediatric? Is somebody pregnant? So should you have contraindications that you never had to have before? So all of these clinical things, factor into understanding state of the art in that corresponding medical field. So again, they keep coming with the helpful guidance documents where I heard Basel Acker talk about it as the guidances aren't going to help you. It's just more words to help understand the words that nobody understood in the first place. So it just creates more confusion. So the MDCG guidance talks about 8 new definitions, but we do not define state of the art or standard of care. But we do mention state of the art 20 times. So, and standard of care, this is the first time they've actually used those words specifically, not just where you have to draw out the context of state of the art around clinical practice. So they are very specific that this is current technical capability with consolidated findings of science, technology, and experience. They've harmonized with the definition for state of the art, saying that it does not necessarily imply the most technological advanced solutions. But it goes on to talk about this concept that they call WET, or well-established technologies. And these are designs with little innovation that have a well-known safety and well-known clinical performance that is defined by the standard of care in a set of devices where there has been little evolution in either the indications or the state of the art, and they have a long history on the market and a long safety profile. So now what does happen with not only our evolution of technology and risk? Well, now you have your standard of care spans all your WET devices. They're still at that early stage of evolution and spans into your state of the art. So you've got 2 aspects with clinical state of the art versus technical state of the art that you have to capture not only in all of your technical documentation, but very heavily in your risk documentation and your clinical evaluation plans. So how do you establish that new state of the art? Well, there are a couple of ways for the higher risk class 3 and some of the class 2B devices. And one is through an expert panel that the commission set up this methodology that companies could seek support for their scientific assessment in delivering opinions and providing ad hoc advice on what does it take to bring these new devices to market where they may or may not have appropriate standards to prove their safety and efficacy. The other methodology is through the commission issuing a common specification for a particular document, a particular device, or a particular technology. However, even though these are long overdue, we only have 3 of those that were promised, and so the commission hasn't even held up their side of what they owe industry to understand and correctly interpret all of these concepts. So are we there yet? Well, now our new state of the art is harmonized with our standard of care. So we're off to the races, but the problem is that as fast as they came together, they could come back apart because that technology is going to keep moving, and it's going to keep moving and kind of pushing the standard of care. So what happens if the state of the art changes? And I really think for these next 2 slides, we could probably do a whole hour unpacking what this means. But you have to look at the risk presented by your device itself, the intended user groups. Notified bodies are getting increasingly fixated on that you have to have clinical data for every user group, or you need to contraindicate. I even know of a recent story of a saline eye drop No chemicals, no medicines, nothing, just salt water. And the notified body, because of all those turnovers that we talked about earlier in this presentation, they had gone through 7 clinical reviewers. And at each stage, the clinical reviewer, they would turn in their findings from the previous clinical reviewer, and well, I have to start all over because that wasn't my review. So, one thing is leading to the other, and they think that they're all buttoned up by review number 6, and reviewer number 7 says, your clinical data doesn't specifically say it's okay to use on pregnant people. So we need to think that you need to add a contraindication for salt water should not go in pregnant people's eyes because we don't know for sure. We don't have the data to know. So think about that. And then also think about in terms of your intended user groups in terms of age and technology. Speaking of the laggards that adopt new technology, what was going to happen if you give this phone to a 12-year-old and say, you need to call 911 or mom's going to die? They're going to be pushing buttons. They're going to be doing all kinds of stuff except for sticking their finger in the hole and rotating. And they're not. If you tell them to call their best friend, they're not going to know the phone number because it's used to be number 3 on my contact list. So, and again, the complexity of the device is going to warrant, is going to push those state-of-the-art changes. So, and then when we just thought it was complex enough, if we really look at what this means in context of these efforts for global harmonization, your poor little manufacturer just got the book thrown at him. So it can seem really overwhelming, but what does this mean for you from a kind of more simplistic standpoint? What can or should you do? Well, first, you need to look at a paradigm shift in your go-to-market strategy. And so this is where it's really important to have a good, solid regulatory strategy that you check and update regularly that includes an assessment of the technology, a current assessment of the indicated use, if you've changed any of those, because you need to do a business market analysis about where it makes sense financially to start. It used to be everybody wanted to come to market first in the EU because they had more harmonized standards. They were accepting that in lieu of stringent clinical evaluations, and the FDA wanted a lot of clinical data. But now we're seeing the opposite, where until recently, companies are all trying to go to America first and then wait and see on what all of these recommendations on the latest round of updates to the MDR might be. So what can you do right now while we're waiting on those updates? You need to think about the alternative treatment methods. And again, this doesn't mean just competitive devices, but what is available across the continuum of care as a whole. You need to be doing benefit-risk ratios, like we talked about with Naval, on your device, and these need to be included and discussed in depth in your clinical evaluation reports. So that's all for me. Let me know if you have any anger, denial, resentment. I don't think there are very few that are at the acceptance stage just yet.